Let's slow down for a moment and stay here together. Imagine a quiet morning, the kind that doesn't announce itself. Soft light slips through the curtains. A room holds its breath. On a small table, a folded script rests beside a familiar pair of reading glasses, ordinary objects, yet heavy with meaning. This is where the story gently begins, not with applause, not with headlines, but with silence. When the news quietly carried the name Catherine O'Hara, many of us felt the same pause. She spent a lifetime making the world laugh, reminding us that humor could be sharp, tender, and deeply human. And yet, her final moments unfolded far from the spotlight, in a space shaped by calm, closeness, and things left unsaid. As we sit with that stillness, a question naturally rises, one we're about to explore together. What truly happened in the final hours of Catherine O'Hara's life? Let's keep walking together, gently. To understand the final chapter, we have to look at the rhythm of her life just before everything slowed down. In her later years, Catherine chose distance over noise, not because she disappeared, but because she had already said what she needed to say. Fame had never been the destination for her. It was simply the road she traveled to do the work she loved. Those close to her often described this period as calm, almost protected. Days were not filled with premieres or red carpets, but with familiar routines. Mornings came without urgency. Afternoons passed with quiet conversations, shared meals, and the comfort of being known without having to perform. There was no dramatic farewell tour, no final public speech, and maybe that was exactly the point. She had always understood timing, in comedy, in acting, and in life. Knowing when to enter a scene mattered just as much as knowing when to step back. In those last months, she stepped back with intention, not out of fear, but out of peace. She was still curious, still observant, still that sharp mind watching the world with gentle irony, but she no longer felt the need to comment on everything. Friends noticed small things. She listened more than she spoke. She laughed, but softer. She remembered stories others had forgotten. There was a sense, not spoken aloud, that she was organizing her memories, placing them carefully where they belonged. Not for the public, for herself. What makes this moment so powerful is its ordinariness. No scandal, no sudden transformation. Just a life gradually narrowing its focus, turning inward toward what mattered most. Family, familiar voices, the safety of spaces that didn't require explanations. And yet, even in this calm, there was weight. Not sadness, exactly, but awareness. The kind that arrives quietly, without drama. The understanding that time, once so elastic, was becoming precise, finite. As we sit with this moment, it becomes clear that the end didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived like dusk, slowly, predictably, almost kindly. Which leads us to the part of the story where everything becomes even quieter, the day itself, when normal routines gave way to something final. And that's where we need to go next. Let's stay with the human side of this story, because no final chapter is ever written alone. Long before the quiet of those last days, her life had already been shaped by relationships that didn't fade when the cameras turned off. This is where the story becomes less about a public figure and more about a woman who belonged deeply to a few people, rather than loosely to many. At the center of it all was her family, not as a symbol, not as a talking point, but as an anchor. Home was never a backdrop for her life. It was the core of it. Those closest to her often said that when she was with family, something softened. The sharp wit remained, but it rested. She didn't need to be on. She could just be present, and presence, for her, was the most generous thing she could give. Then there were the friendships that grew quietly, almost invisibly, across decades of work. People who met her early in her career often stayed, not because of obligation, but because she created space for loyalty. She didn't compete for attention. She shared it, she listened, and in an industry built on ego, that made her rare. One relationship that always carried a special tenderness was with those who shared long creative histories with her. Years of standing side by side, learning each other's rhythms, knowing when to lead and when to follow. These weren't just colleagues, they were witnesses. They saw her not only succeed, but doubt. Not only shine, but step back. And those witnesses carry a different kind of grief, because they lose not just a person, but a shared past that no one else fully understands. There was also the unexpected kind of bond she formed with younger actors, especially those who, at vulnerable moments, found in her a steady presence. To them, she wasn't a legend. She was safety. She was consistency. Someone who showed up the same way every time. Someone who made space without asking for anything in return. As her life slowed, these relationships didn't disappear. They grew quieter, more intimate. Conversations didn't stretch late into the night anymore. Sometimes they were just brief check-ins, a shared memory, a laugh over something small. But even in that simplicity, there was meaning. What makes this part so haunting is the sense that not everything needed to be said out loud. There were no grand confessions, no dramatic goodbyes, just understanding, the kind that exists when people know each other well enough to read silence. And maybe that's the hardest truth to sit with, that the most important connections in her life didn't demand closure. They didn't need final speeches. They were already complete. As we move forward, we're about to step into the most delicate moment of this story, the space where words fall away entirely and only atmosphere remains. Let's move carefully into this moment, not to dramatize it, not to explain it away, but to sit with it as it was. The final day didn't arrive with warning signs or a sense of urgency. It began like so many others had recently, quietly, almost gently, as if nothing important was about to happen at all. The morning carried a familiar stillness. Light filtered through the room without effort, touching the walls, the floor, the objects that had become part of a daily ritual. There was no rush, no schedule to keep. Just time moving at its own pace. This was not a day that announced itself as an ending. It felt, at first, like continuation. Small details mattered more than usual. The way the room smelled, the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the pause before someone spoke. These are the things people remember later, not because they were significant in the moment, but because they became fixed once everything else stopped. Those nearby sensed a subtle shift, though no one named it. Conversations grew softer. Movements became more deliberate, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if everyone had quietly agreed to protect the calm. No one wanted to break it. At some point, routine gave way to awareness. Not panic, just recognition. A call was made. Then another. Time, which had felt wide and forgiving, suddenly became precise. Minutes mattered. Distances felt longer than usual. The world outside the room continued on as normal, unaware that something irreversible was unfolding in a space it would never see. What followed wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. It was marked by waiting. Waiting in hallways, waiting in silence, waiting without knowing exactly what one was waiting for. The kind of waiting that stretches the mind, where thoughts drift between memory and hope, between acceptance and resistance. Inside the room, there was no performance. No final message delivered for effect, just presence. Hands held, chairs pulled closer, breathing noticed for the first time, as if it were something fragile. The ordinary act of being alive became suddenly precious, unbearably so. No one spoke about legacy. No one talked about career, awards, or impact. Those things felt distant, almost irrelevant. What mattered in that space was far simpler. Who was there, and who was not. Who had already said what needed to be said, and who assumed there would be more time. There's a strange honesty that appears in moments like this. Without speeches or explanations, people understand things they've avoided for years. Regrets don't always announce themselves as pain. Sometimes they appear as a quiet wish, small, contained, impossible to act on. And then, without a clear dividing line, the moment arrived. Not as a dramatic shift, but as a gentle absence. A stillness deeper than the one that came before. The kind that tells you something has changed even before you can name it. Afterward, the room felt different. Not emptier, just altered. Objects stayed where they were. Light continued to move. But everything now belonged to the past tense. What had been part of a life became part of a memory. This is the part of the story where many people search for meaning, for symbolism, for something poetic enough to make sense of it all. But sometimes, the truth is quieter than that. Sometimes, a life ends not with a message, but with a moment, and the rest is left to those who remain. And that's where the story shifts next. Because what happens after a person is gone often reveals just as much as the way they lived. Let's stay with what comes next, because the hours after someone is gone often feel unreal. Time resumes, but awkwardly, like it's unsure whether it should keep moving forward. The room empties slowly. Chairs are pushed back into place. Doors close softly. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything has changed. News doesn't spread immediately. It moves carefully, passed from one voice to another, as if people are afraid that saying it out loud might make it heavier. When it finally reaches the outside world, the reaction is quiet at first. Then it grows. Messages appear, memories resurface. People begin to realize how long she had been part of their lives without them noticing. What's striking is the consistency of the response. Not shock, not scandal, just gratitude. Stories emerge that feel almost identical in tone, even when they come from different decades and different places. She made people feel safe. She made them laugh without making them feel small. She showed that humor could be generous, not cruel. For some, the loss feels strangely personal. They remember watching her performances with parents who are no longer here. They remember lines spoken during moments when life felt uncertain. Her work had quietly attached itself to ordinary memories, holidays, evenings at home, shared laughter. And now those memories feel newly fragile. Behind the scenes, there is the quieter grief, the kind that doesn't appear online. The people who return to homes that no longer hold her voice. The routines that suddenly don't make sense anymore. The realization that certain conversations, ones that felt unimportant before, will never happen again. There is no rush to commemorate. No immediate attempt to define her legacy. It's as if everyone instinctively understands that this is not a moment for summary. This is a moment for pause. And in that pause, something subtle happens. People don't just remember what she did, they remember how she was, how she carried herself, how she listened, how she never seemed to demand attention, even when she deserved it. The world continues, as it always does. But there's a faint sense of absence, a missing frequency that only becomes noticeable once it's gone. And slowly, almost reluctantly, people begin to look backward, not to analyze her life, but to understand what remains. Which brings us to the final question. Not about her, but about us. Let's end this by looking at what doesn't disappear. Because when someone leaves quietly, the temptation is to search for a grand explanation to wrap a life into a neat conclusion. But some lives resist that. They don't resolve. They linger. What remains is not a single role or performance. It's a tone, a way of being in the world. The understanding that humor doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. That kindness doesn't need to announce itself. That presence can matter more than recognition. Her legacy doesn't ask to be defended or elevated. It simply exists. In scenes people revisit without realizing why they still matter. In characters that feel exaggerated on the surface, but deeply human underneath. In the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to prove her worth. There's something instructive in that, especially now. In a world that rewards volume, she chose precision. In an industry that thrives on reinvention, she remained herself, and in doing so, she built something more durable than attention. She built trust. As time passes, her name will be spoken less frequently. That's inevitable. But the feeling she left behind, the sense of warmth, of intelligence, of restraint that stays, it settles into the background of people's lives, where the most meaningful things usually live. This isn't a story about an ending. It's a story about completion. Not because everything was said or resolved, but because nothing essential was missing. She gave what she had to give. And she did it without spectacle. So maybe the real question isn't what happened in her final moments. Maybe it's this. If a life can be remembered not for its noise, but for its steadiness, not for its urgency, but for its care, then what kind of trace are we each leaving behind? That's where we'll stop. Not with an answer, but with the space to ask it.